The topic today is very sensitive. And the passage of the scriptures that we will be reading and studying has to do with some unpleasant topics that many find not disturbing, but yes, unpleasant to talk about. But this is in the scripture. So what we have set out to do is to read the Bible from the book of Genesis through all the books till the end, to the book of Revelation. We will continue doing today. And the portion is the book of Leviticus, chapters 13, 14, and 15. The series title is God's Story. And today we will be talking about ritual uncleanness. God's story, ritual uncleanness. The first question that we will ask is, what caused ritual uncleanness? What were the sources? In what cases did a person become unclean? That's the first question. And what I'm trying to do is to systematize biblical data on the matter. And we will start with the book of Leviticus and then add two more passages from the book of Numbers to paint the whole picture, to know what specifically caused ceremonial uncleanness according to the Torah, to the Pentateuch. Okay? That's our goal for this first portion of today's sermon. And I'd like to invite you to read the book of Leviticus chapter 11, verses 24 through 31. Leviticus chapter 11, verses 24 through 31. And by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries any part of their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Verse 27. And all that walk on their paws among the animals that go on all four are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. And he who carries their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They are unclean to you. 29. And these are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground: the mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean to you among all that swarm. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening. So what's the first source of uncleanness? Corpses, remains of unclean animals. That's the first. Second, same chapter, the book of Leviticus chapter 11, verse 39 says, and if any animal which you may eat dies, whoever touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Second source is a corpse, a carcass of a clean animal. And it doesn't mean that whenever you want to buy a piece of meat in the store, let's say, you become unclean. If that animal was killed, was slaughtered, was butchered, and so forth, then that's not the case. What the text says, if it dies, right, on its own, or in virtue of someone, like maybe other animal killing it and so forth, but there was no slaughtering, there was no slaughterhouse and so forth. If any animal which you may eat dies, then touching it, dealing with it, brings ceremonial uncleanness. That's second source. Source number 3. Let's go to the book of Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in her blood of her purifying for 66 days. The third cause for ceremonial uncleanness, what could be called natural or physiological discharge from the body. And 2 cases are being mentioned here: regular periods for women and a period after there is a birth of a child, when the body needs to get well, to get strength, and which is accompanied by some loss of blood as well. And this is about women. Now about males. Let's go to the book of Leviticus chapter 15, verses 16 through 18. If a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and be unclean until the evening. And every garment and every skin on which the semen comes shall be washed with water and be unclean until the evening. If a man lies with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them shall bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. So again, this is natural physiological discharge. The first is called pollution, typically happens during night for men, or if there is a sexual intercourse with ejaculation, this also makes both him and her unclean. Again, this is something that could be characterized as natural physiological discharge from the body, and this is cause number 3. Now let's move on further with the text, and we come to the book of Leviticus chapter 13, first 3 verses. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling, or an eruption, or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priests. And the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body, and if the hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest shall examine him, he shall pronounce him unclean. When a man, verse number 9 through 11, when a man is afflicted with a leprous disease, he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall look. And if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic leprous disease in the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He shall not shut him up, for he is unclean. When you go through Leviticus chapter 13, there are different skin conditions are there. Skin conditions are described, various skin diseases. It could be leprosy, it could be other kinds of problems with the skin that emit liquid. We just read about raw flesh. You could imagine it, right? It's open wound, and something is constantly coming out of it. So there are different terms that's used in the original. One of them is loosely translated as leprosy, but other cases and other health conditions and skin conditions are also mentioned there. So if there's any kind of regular discharge, or there is an open wound that has any kind of liquid accumulating there, that's the cause for a person to be declared unclean. So the fourth reason and the fourth source of uncleanness is various skin diseases. Now, condition number 5, reason number 5. Let's go to the book of Leviticus, chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this is the law of his uncleanness for discharge, whether the body runs with his discharge or his body is blocked up by his discharge. It is his uncleanness." So this is the case of something chronic that's happening, something not comparable to what we just read a couple of minutes ago that has to do with healthy physiological functions of body emitting some liquids. This is something that stays with the person, what could be called as chronic discharge from the body. Then in verse 25, about women, if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge shall continue in she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Different conditions, women's organs issues that produce emissions. If that's a chronic situation, that for the duration of this illness, this issue, a woman is also unclean. So source number 5 would be chronic discharge from the body. Now, source number 6. We will go to the next book of the Bible, the book of Numbers, chapter 19, verses 11 and 16. 11 and 16. Whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. Whoever in the open field touches someone who was killed with a sword, or who died naturally, or touches a human bone or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. So if someone touches any kind of human remains, this brings uncleanness. That's reason number 6. And finally, number 7, Numbers 19:22, and whatever the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and anyone who touches it shall be unclean until evening. So touching someone who is unclean makes the person unclean as well. So it's not the first-hand experience. Someone became unclean in virtue of touching something, and if someone touches the unclean person, the person himself or herself becomes unclean as well. So reason number 7, or source number 7, is touching an unclean person also produces ceremonial uncleanness. Now the question, what is common in all these 7 cases? What's the common thread? What's the common theme? Death, tissue withering away, decomposition, and so forth. So it's all connected to dying, to the process of dying, whether there is a discharge from the body and then it is decomposing, or there is something in the body that's not right physiologically, and there is this swelling, there is this emission, and so forth. This is all connected to the theme of death and dying. All these cases. That's what's common for all these conditions. This renders a person unclean. Now, what shall the person do? Does it mean that a person becomes guilty of something, or sinful, or morally responsible? Let's take the case of intercourse. Is it a sin? If it's a husband and wife, it is an act of obedience to God's commandment, because there is this commandment, the first one actually in the Bible, be fruitful and multiply, right? Or caring for a wounded person, let's say replacing bandages, right? Or burying a person, washing the dead body and preparing for burial and so forth. This is a commandment. For example, Joseph in Egypt, when he was dying, he charged his brothers and his relatives and his descendants, saying, I will die, but the Lord will visit you and will bring you out of Egypt. And when it happens, make sure, take my bones, take my remains with you and carry them out of Egypt into the promised land. So some people had to be carrying that sarcophagus all the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness till they came to the land of promise. So, as you could see, this is all just life. The life format since sin entered has decomposing, has illnesses, has issues, has death in it. And some parts are not even connected to death at all. But this all leads us to a very important conclusion. Ceremonial uncleanness is not a sin. Ceremonial uncleanness is a state that limits people's ability to do things. Which ones? We will soon discover. If a person becomes unclean, what was he or she to do? How would you deal with this condition? Let's go to the topic of cleansing. Was there a way to get cleansing from being ritually unclean? The book of Leviticus chapter 11, verses 24 and 25. And by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. What's the first element? How do you get clean again? You allow a passage of time. So in some cases, you would wait till when? Till the evening. Why evening? Because evening, biblically, is when the new day starts. New 24-hour cycle starts. It's from evening till evening. So this is the borderline between days, right? So first, to get clean again, you wait. In some cases, till the end of the day. In some cases, 7 days. In some cases, 14 days. But first element is time. What's the next element? Let's go on reading. It says, verse 25, and whoever carries any part of their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. What's the second? Washing. Sometimes it says wash clothes, sometimes it tells wash your body and so forth, but there is water involved, right? So time and washing are the two ways to get cleaned. In other cases, let's go to the book of Leviticus chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. Something else was done, 12, 6 to 8. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb, a year old, for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. So first element again is time. If it's a male child, 1 week, 7 days, and then 33 days. If it's a female child, then 2 weeks and 66 days. So time needs to pass. And after that, a sacrifice, a lamb or 2 birds. If a person is not that wealthy, then at least 2 birds are offered. So to get clean, there is time element and there is a sacrifice. So there is a ritual, there is a ceremony. That's why it's called ceremonial uncleanness or ritual uncleanness, right? For males, the same procedure for men in the case of chronic emission. Leviticus chapter 15, same offering was prescribed. The ritual of cleansing after healing from leprosy is more complicated. There is oil involved, there is hyssop involved, there is sacrifice, there is touching of blood, touching of a ear, thumb, and your toe with blood, and so forth. It's a more complicated ritual because, leprosy is a more serious condition. But in any case, again, 2 elements, time and the ritual. Sacrifices and sprinkling and so forth. It also includes using and utilizing the sanctuary to become clean again. So, a person who becomes ritually unclean does not become guilty or sinful. This is not a moral condition. This is a ritual condition. This is a ceremonial condition. And there was a way provided how to get back to being clean again. At this point, it is extremely important to differentiate between 2 kinds of uncleanness, 2 different conditions, 2 different states of uncleanness. This one, the one that we are studying today, the one that's called ritual or ceremonial uncleanness, this is what theologians sometimes call temporary uncleanness because of the period of time factor and also ritual factor. But there was a type of uncleanness that is natural or innate. And that's the one that we studied last time when we talked about clean and unclean animals. So let me test you. What's the term in the original that's used to designate all unclean animals? There were 2 terms. So if you get me at least one, I'll be extremely happy. It starts with shekets. Remember? Shekets, that's the first word. That's a technical term describing something repulsive, something dirty, something that you would never eat. This could be excrements and so forth. So, shekets is the first one. The second one is toeva. This is, shekets is translated as detestable most often, and then the toeva is translated as abomination, abhorrence, something that you would never touch, and eating is out of the question whatsoever. So this is the designation of unclean animals. This condition is impossible to clean. There is no ritual. There is no time. Whether you keep a pig in your house for 7 days or 7 years, it will not help her to become clean. If you wash it, if you offer a sacrifice, if you sprinkle it with oil or whatever, it will still be unclean. It will be shekets, it will be toeva. Because this kind of uncleanness is innate. It's internal. It is natural because of the anatomical structure and physiological features of this animal. So it's important to differentiate between these two. Permanent, natural, innate uncleanness, sheket stoeva, and ritual, temporarily, ceremonial uncleanness, which is acquired, which is not transferred to become yours by definition. Let me give you an illustration. There is a story about a Russian Orthodox monk who, during the Great Fast period, the 40-day fast that precedes Easter, well, they don't use the term Easter there, but an equivalent to the English term Easter, where Lord's Passion and his death and resurrection is being celebrated and stuff. So during those 40 days, the tradition in that Christianity is that you don't eat meat. You are fasting. So the fast is basically a form of vegetarianism, but not strictly, because some of the flesh is permitted to eat. For example, fish is allowed. Right? So according to this story that I'm trying to convey from Russian into English, this monk, after fasting for more than 30 days, he was so filled with a desire, with craving to eat some pork. But how would you go about the rules of the fast? It's not allowed. So this is what he came up with. He took a piece of meat, he dipped it into water 3 times, and he said, "I now baptize you to become a lamb." And it worked. He ate the meat not as pork, but as a piece of lamb. Of course, this is a fictitious story. This is not possible. Unclean will never become clean if it's a natural, innate, born into uncleanness. So, 2 types of uncleanness, extremely important to differentiate. Okay. We talked about the sources of uncleanness, of ritual uncleanness. Now, the process of cleansing. And lastly, what's the rationale? What's the underlying reason for these laws to exist? Why did God bother to go into so many details about how to determine whether it's a clean or unclean person, and then there is this ritual, in each case a different one. What is the matter? What is the essence of things? Well, let's go to the book of Leviticus chapter 12, verse 4. 12:4. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. So this is what it meant for a person's life. 2 things are mentioned. Let's talk first about the sanctuary. She shall not come into the sanctuary. What does it mean? Could any woman, could any person, for that matter, enter into the sanctuary unless this person is a priest? No. What it means is that even the outer court of the sanctuary was a holy place, was a sacred place, was a separated place. And to come to the courts of the temple or the sanctuary, a person had to be ceremonially clean. So, first limitation, not come into the sanctuary. It meant that person would not be able to participate in the festivals. 3 times of the year, people were commanded to come to the sanctuary. So festivals that required visiting the sanctuary were out of limits. Then, if a person lived nearby, then the Bible tells us that they would come in the morning, during morning sacrifice, burnt offering sacrifice, and the evening, and people would do what? They would pray in the courts of the temple, right? This was also impossible. So any visit, either with the person of celebrating or praying or offering a sacrifice, was not allowed. That's the first limitation. Let's read about this in the book of Leviticus chapter 15, verse 31. 15:31. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle or sanctuary that is in their midst. What was the purpose of the law? Tabernacle was the place where God physically appeared. Tabernacle, sanctuary, was God's house. And God is life and the source of life. So anything that resembles death or impurity or any contact with death or decomposing and so forth was removed very far from God's presence. So the Bible literally says, you shall keep the people separate so that they would not die in their uncleanness, because if they enter there, they will defile my tabernacle. Another place is the book of Numbers, chapter 19, verse 20, 19:20. If the man who is unclean does not cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, since he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. Because the water for impurity has not been thrown on him, he is unclean. A person could die. Being in the state of ceremonial uncleanness and entering into the court of the sanctuary meant that the person could just perish, because God is holy, and nothing that is connected to death can be there in his presence. The person could die. So first, it was a measure of what? It was a safety measure to keep people from dying if they are entering the courts. So God and death are diametrically opposite phenomena. They were never together. So let's ask the following question. The first limitation was that you could not go to worship God in the sanctuary specifically. Just remember that there was only one sanctuary for all the land of Israel, right? So this is not about attending synagogue or something else. This is only about attending the sanctuary. Now, the second phrase is, she shall not touch anything holy. What is holy? Is this book holy? It says Holy Bible, right? How about communion, bread and then wine? Is this holy? Is the place of worship holy? Are you holy? The answer to all of those questions are yes. But in what sense? What kind of holiness is this text describing? It's about the holiness connected to the sanctuary. Because it's in one line. Let me read it to you again. I hope you are following. Are you? I hope you are following, because it's easy to get lost in these technicalities. But you will see why it is important to understand. Okay? So follow me, please. she shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary. Do you see the connection? So the holiness that's being talked about is something that's connected to the sanctuary. What specifically? Well, two things could be mentioned. Let's go to the book of Leviticus chapter 7, verses 20 and 21. And if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether human uncleanness or an unclean beast, or any unclean, detestable creature, then eats some flesh from the sacrifice of the Lord's peace offering, that person shall be cut off from his people. What's holy in this text? Peace offering. And why? Because for the peace offering, an animal would be slaughtered, and then part of the animal would be offered on the altar, and then the rest of the meat would be eaten by the people. And because there was this contact of this animal with the sanctuary service, with the altar of burnt offerings, that was rendering this piece of animal holy. And it says, let me read it to you again, if someone has this uncleanness and eats some flesh from the sacrifice of the Lord's peace offering, that person shall be cut off from his people. So the phrase, shall not touch anything holy, refers to, first of all, peace offering, because it's connected to the sanctuary. The second, Numbers 9, verses 9 through 13, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if any one of you or of your descendants is unclean through touching a dead body, or is on a long journey, he shall still keep the Passover to the Lord. In the second month of the 14th day at twilight, they shall keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs and so forth. So on the 14th day of the first month, which is Aviv or Nisan, everyone celebrated. But if a person is unclean, then the person would do what? Do it the second month, the same date. So the second Passover. So what it shows is that you could eat the Passover lamb only in the state of ritual purity, ritual cleanness, right? So why? Because the Passover lamb was killed by the altar. People would bring their lambs, ministers would assist them, so the slaughtering would happen there, and then people would take the animal, right, the killed animal, and would then roast it and eat it with herbs and so forth. So the Passover lamb is another holy thing that a person in the state of ceremonial uncleanness was not able to eat because it had this connection with the sanctuary. So this is the essence of the limitations. You are not able to attend the temple, its services, even the courtyard, and you would not be allowed to participate in the festivals and in consuming either the peace offering or the Passover lamb. Now, are these laws in effect today? Our last question. What do you think? I think it should be obvious at this point. Is there a sanctuary? No. Is there a chance to wander onto its territory? No. There is no sanctuary. There are no sacrifices. Even if a person observed the 40-day period or 80-day, the time factor is still there, but there is no priest to offer a sacrifice. Sacrifices are not allowed anywhere but on the Temple Mountain, right? So it's absolutely impossible to either break the holiness of that territory or to become unclean, to become clean again, even if a person believes that these laws are still to be observed. And I would mention that in Judaism, it's still the case, meaning this understanding. Let me read to you from a commentary by Hertz. The laws of ritual purity and impurity determine whether a person can enter the territory of the temple. Therefore, after the destruction of the temple, these laws lost their practical significance and are no longer observed. For Christians who know and understand and accept that Jesus Christ became a Lamb of God and offered his life as a sacrifice, and then he became a priest in the heavenly sanctuary, this is especially clear because all these laws that were governing the earthly sanctuary are not to be kept any longer because they have fulfilled their purpose. If you want to read about this in more details, you could go to the epistle to Hebrews chapter 9, verses 8 through 14. How about the second part of it? First, we took a look at some of the limitations connected to the sanctuary and spiritual life. How about person-to-person contact? We read that there were some limitations, meaning it was not prohibited to touch an unclean person, but you would know that you would become unclean again as well. There is one very important verse, though there is a lot more to be said, but let me just bring the main point across. Leviticus 5:11, rather 15. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 11. Anyone whom the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. What's the main point of this verse? Take a look at it again. It's on the screen. What's the main point? Without having rinsed his hands in water. So it says that if an unclean person, are you following me? If an unclean person rinses his or her hands in water and then touches a clean person, what happens? Nothing happens. Do you see it? What's the underlying reason? How is it called? Hygiene, brothers and sisters. Hygiene and sanitation. Right? This is still valid. Germs are still there. You know, the microorganisms that transfer diseases, they still do what they did when Moses was writing all these laws. If we had time, we would also read about the quarantine for 7 days and then for another 7 days. We will read that. Leviticus chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip. This is what you are doing right now. I am allowed to not cover my upper lip. This is masking, because there is more than 15 feet of distance, right? Between me talking and you sitting. But masking is mandated in the Bible in the case when there was spitting described in elsewhere and so forth, when there is this danger that microorganisms could travel and infect other people. So masking is mentioned, and also isolation. He shall remain unclean, he shall live alone. He shall live alone. His dwelling place be outside the camp. So these principles are still valid, and God gave them centuries before people understood why. Nobody knew about microorganisms and how they operate and how they multiply and how they are transferred and so forth. But God in His wisdom gave the laws that have these application even outside the context of the sanctuary. God is wise, and we're so thankful that He is. Amen.